Hi, my name is Grace Lunan. I'm a freshman at Notre Dame and part of NDISC, and today I'm going to be interviewing Professor Rachel Myrick. To start off, could you maybe summarize what you're going to be talking about in your seminar today and highlight your main arguments?
Sure. So today I'm going to be talking about a book that's forthcoming called Polarization and International Politics. As you may know, a lot of democracies around the world are grappling with this problem of political polarization, and this book is starting to think about how polarization might actually affect democratic foreign policy making. We know a lot about how the causes and consequences of polarization for domestic politics in society, but we know relatively less about how polarization is affecting international politics. So that's what this book is about. And the primary argument of the book is that polarization has a variety of negative, underappreciated consequences for foreign affairs. In particular, it can undermine the ability of democracies to make stable foreign policies, and also, negatively impact the ability of democracies to be able to credibly issue threats to adversaries and to be able to reliably make and keep international commitments to their allies.
That's really interesting. Could you tell me a little bit about the two different types of restraints that act on democratic leaders and how each type is weakened by partisan, polarized politics?
Right. So we typically think about democracies as having these two different systems of constraint. So the first system of constraint is a vertical constraints or accountability to the public or to an electorate. And we generally think about the fact that in a healthy liberal democracy, the public will keep a leader accountable for their foreign policy decision making. They'll punish them electorally if the leader makes bad decisions and or if they violate norms or procedures in the foreign policy making process. But as polarization grows, we can think about how those constraints start to weaken because a partisan public is going to really care about seeing their preferred policy enacted or their preferred candidate win, and they're going to care comparatively less about those other concerns. The second system of constraints is a system of horizontal constraints or accountability to other actors within government. Most notably, we think about accountability to a political opposition. In a healthy democracy, the political opposition's role is to check the executive, but we can think about how as polarization increases, the opposition is going to increasingly try to obstruct the executive and has incentives to sort of undermine its foreign policy agenda, and as a consequence, it's not going to be as effective at keeping the leader accountable.
To continue looking at your read ahead for today's talk, you also argued that in periods of extreme polarization, institutions, nonpartisan foreign policy institutions can be eroded. Mm-hmm. Now, given that recently the Trump administration has issued a lot of executive orders cutting funding for these sorts of federal institutions and various federal institutions, what might incentivize a leader to completely dismantle nonpartisan institutions instead of reforming or politicizing them?
Sure. So one of the arguments the book makes is that as polarization grows, there are more incentives for politicians to politicize, as you mentioned, these nonpartisan foreign policy institutions. And the book outlines a variety of different strategies that leaders might use to politicize these institutions. I think what we're seeing with the Trump administration right now, as you refer to, is what I might call a strategy of transformation. That is, hollowing out the federal workforce and appointing more ideological figures to head some of these ostensibly nonpartisan institutions. At the extremes of that are dismantling, actually, of agencies and institutions, and we've seen some of that with Trump's recent dismantling of USAID, which of course is the backbone of U.S. international development assistance. I think the reason that a leader might choose to take that strategy is really to sort of demonstrate a strong ideological commitment. And in Trump's case, I think it's a commitment to an America First foreign policy agenda and to an unwinding of longstanding U.S. principles of multilateralism and internationalism. And so it's also, I think, a response to the Biden administration, which had really prioritized humanitarian assistance and international development and had elevated USAID And so stepping back, I think this is part of a trend we're going to see more broadly as polarization increases in American politics, that presidents are increasingly going to try to not only accomplish their own foreign policy objectives, but also try to dismantle or undo accomplishments of a previous administration with the opposite party in charge.
Talking now about vertical and horizontal restraints, how might the erosion of these restraints enable the Trump administration to more effectively carry out the dismantling of these institutions?
So I think that kind of circles back to this question about vertical accountability. That if the public, if it is so partisan, then they might not inherently object to that, or you might see kind of asymmetric objections from the opposite party, but not critiques from within his own party. And so I think that just speaks to the fact that as politics grows more polarized, people have stronger partisan identity. They're going to be less likely to criticize members of their own party, and they're going to be more critical of members of the opposite party.
I want to talk a little bit more about one of your other works that you just recently published, in which you argued that there's no evidence to suggest that the increase in domestic polarization in the U.S. also increases the material boldness of rivals of the U.S., such as China. Given this argument, do you think that the U.S. is protected from having its position in the international order significantly weakened by polarization, or do you think that domestic polarization still poses a threat to the U.S.'s international status?
I would say I generally agree with the latter, but to kind of contextualize that piece, so that was an article I co-wrote with a co-author at University of Idaho, Chen Wang, and what we did was run a public opinion survey in China, and we found that heightening perceptions of polarization in the United States from the Chinese perspective didn't actually make the Chinese public want to be more assertive or more aggressive towards the U.S. in foreign policy. And so what we ultimately concluded in that paper was that it's not necessarily the case that polarization is inherently emboldening foreign adversaries, but rather a lot of America's adversaries are referencing polarization and dysfunction in the U.S. as a means to sort of shore up their own control, right? To make democracy look bad and to kind of strengthen authoritarian control. But I also think so while the conclusions of that paper, I think, are a little bit less pessimistic, there also are a variety of more subtle negative impacts of polarization in terms of global perceptions of the U.S. I do think we have some good evidence that the global public is more skeptical of U.S. commitments given polarization, and there's also greater uncertainty about the future of U.S. foreign policy and the future of U.S. global leadership.
Thank you so much for joining us today,
Thank you.
And I'm excited to hear your seminar talk.
Great, thank you so much. It was great to meet you.